Hello there, everybody. This is an unplanned, unexpected weekly live stream on a Monday. Now, before you miss it, there's still going to be a live stream this coming Thursday. But what happened was that I have interviews set up for the next quite a few weeks, right? Really, an interview every single week moving forward. And I posted a video this last weekend on three reasons why people do not believe in God. And that video received some comments that I wanted to address. And I want to address these comments for two reasons. One is some of the objections raised against my video, I thought were very good points raised that I wanted to explain and maybe even go a little bit further in my agreement with the person who commented. And the second reason why is because there were some other comments that I think can be very valuable in helping us, no matter if you're a Christian or an atheist, in learning how to better have productive and fruitful conversations, which hopefully is our goal as people who desire to know what is true. And so if you want to know what's true, and you're trying to figure out what the truth is, and you're trying to understand atheism, or you're trying to understand Christianity, hopefully this discussion and response to the objections raised against my latest video will be of help to you. And as I started to record this as just a normal video that I was going to post tonight, and I went about 10 minutes or so and realized I had more things to say than I thought. And I thought, well, hey, why not make it a live stream and hopefully get some interaction from you as well? So we'll be talking through some of the comments and objections that were made to my latest video. You can see that in the description below, or if you're watching this after the fact, the link should pop up right there. And then you can check out that video if you're unaware of the context of the conversation we're going to talk about. But in this video, I simply posted there are three reasons why people reject a belief in God. And these would be intellectual rejections, volitional rejections, and emotional rejections. Some people simply don't have evidence. Other people just have a will to do something else. And other people have emotionally been hurt by the church, and that is why they reject belief in God. And this came from me asking my students the question of what influences your beliefs. And I think that a lot of people reject a belief in God because really we aren't making our decisions always based on evidence. Our culture, our family, our friends, popularity, and often what it seems to be of most benefit to us influences what we believe in more than evidence and truth does. And I think this relates to belief in God as well. Now, there's a big difference, and we'll talk about that. There's a difference between a belief that God exists and then actually believing in him. And when I say that, I mean trusting in him, putting your trust and faith in God and trusting that he is good and trusting him for salvation. And so I think there's a difference there. So we're going to jump into the comments and the objections made on that video. And hopefully that this is a helpful thing. As a teacher, I want to use real interactions as teaching experiences or as teaching lessons, and hopefully this is a help to you as well. So the first comment that came in was actually in response to other individuals who commented on this video. So this is kind of in response to their comments of how they enjoyed and liked the video. And here it is. The individual wrote, "Do you notice that he asked his Christian students about what influences them in the decisions they make? And then he pretended that had something to do with being convinced of the truth claim. He is blatantly dishonest here." Now, I'll get into this a little bit, but I did push back because my students are not Christians. And we'll talk about this here in a moment for his response. But he continues on, he says this, "Belief isn't a decision. You're either convinced of something or you're not. If you don't agree with that, test it for yourself. Decide to believe in magic leprechauns for a week, or in Ganesh, Thor, Zeus, whatever you find silly. Don't just pretend to believe, because pretending is a choice. No, actually make the decision to believe. Something you now find to be silly. Obviously, that's impossible." And I actually do agree on this point, right? And you can test it for yourself, just like he said. Believe that there is an elephant in the room behind you. You can't just simply believe that when you know it's not true. You can't convince yourself when the evidence and your experience clearly tells you otherwise. And so there are definitely beliefs that we have that are not choices, that are influenced by our observation and the evidence around us. I completely agree here, and I think that's a good point. We'll get into a little bit more here in a second. He goes on to say, "I could no more decide to believe in gods than I could decide to believe in magic leprechauns. On the other hand, I'd believe in gods or magic leprechauns if I saw good evidence that they actually existed. And no, I mean evidence, not just a gish gallop of vague claims. Do you have one piece of good evidence?" And we'll come back to this one. "One piece of good evidence that your God actually exists? How about one piece of good evidence that any magical stories in the Bible actually happened? Your choice. No? Well, that's why I'm an atheist. It's not a decision. It's not that I won't believe in the diverse contradictory claims of theists. It's that I can't believe in them without good evidence. And they're actually true. And that's a very different thing from what he asked his students. Very different. Now, I don't think this is different than what I asked my students. Now, first of all, the first comment about my students being Christians. Now, this individual has commented before and has brought up this point before of how I just have a bunch of Christian students that probably agree with what I say. And that's actually not true. Most of my students are not Christians. The vast majority, I think, are not Christians. I haven't done a specific poll lately, but I know in the past it's been somewhere around 70% non-Christian students at my school. Now, I think this is a very helpful lesson. And the last few live streams that I've done are addressing the problem of evil and why God would allow evil. And one thing that you can address here is that with limited information, something might seem unreasonable. Now, he points that out before next, and we're not going to get here just yet, but I do want to point it out in one of his comments. I think we have it right here. Yes. He says, in my comment addressing the fact that the majority of my students are not Christians, he says, I don't believe you. I can see Christian, Jesus, and pray on the wall behind you. If I couldn't, that would be an extraordinary claim, a whole classroom full of atheists who just happen to go to school where they can be taught Christianity. Right? He says this is an extraordinary claim. Now, where I want to address this and where I think this relates also to the problem of evil is simply this. When we have a limited amount of information, things might sound extraordinary. It's because we maybe don't have all the facts, right? If you just hear that there's a 300-pound man or 400 pounds or 350 pounds who is a professional athlete, that sounds unreasonable. And this is from a video by William Lane Craig and Reasonable Faith. They use this example. But when you find out that this individual is a sumo wrestler, now that makes sense that this is a world champion professional athlete and still weighs 350 or 400 pounds. And here's the whole point. It seems unreasonable to think that a Christian school in Southern California would have a majority non-Christian or non-religious, mainly non-Christian students until you get some more information. I actually did mention this comment to one of my classes, to which they found very amusing because that class is vastly majority non-Christian. The reason why is I work in an international school, where the vast majority of my students are from mainland China and hold to secularism and no religious affiliation whatsoever, because it's an international school. And I think that once you get that understanding that this is not a private Christian school in Southern California, but this is an international school of mostly Chinese students, and we do have local students as well, then all of a sudden this new information makes what seems to be an extraordinary claim maybe not so extraordinary. But that's not necessarily the point, but I think that's important because, as I mentioned, this applies to why God allows evil. That if you only have a certain amount of information as to why God would allow something to happen, it might seem unreasonable or extraordinary. But as you learn more evidence, like how could God exist if there's so much pain and suffering? Well, that's not the only argument for God's existence. Once we factor in all the other arguments for God's existence and we have evidence for God and then what seems to be evidence against God in the problem of evil, the evidence maybe doesn't seem so powerful as it once did for some. Anyways, but the main thing I want to say here is that he says that this is a very different thing than what I ask my students, that I am asking them to choose to and decide what they want to believe. And here I think that there's two important points. One is that the claim that I made is not against what an atheist would claim for themselves. In fact, he says that here in this next post. Let me pull it up here. This one. Right there in... Oh, I just missed it. There we go. In the second paragraph here, he says, so you're simply comparing apples to oranges. That you asked a question, your students, Christian students, right? No, they're not. And then just pretended that their answers apply to atheists when it comes to completely different question. Could you have been even more dishonest? Now, I'm not just pretending that it applies. And I mentioned here that it actually does apply. That the response that I'm giving actually does apply. And the reason why is because one of the responses is an intellectual rejection of God. That some people do have intellectual reasons where they have not seen enough evidence, that they do think that there are intellectual and evidential problems, and therefore they are not convinced. But other people have seen evidence and they simply just don't care. And the example I gave here was with smoking. Some people know that smoking causes cancer, but they just don't care because they like the feeling that smoking gives. In fact, we do a lot of things that seem unreasonable given the evidence that we do, but that thing presents, maybe a pleasure for us. It gives us satisfaction. It makes us more popular, and we choose to do those things. And so what I mention in the video is not just some random thing that doesn't apply to atheists, but it does, in that some have intellectual rejections, some have volitional, and some are more emotional. The second thing, though, that is so important in this part about deciding to believe that God exists is there's a difference, and I pointed this out, there's a difference between believing that God exists and believing in God. Belief that versus belief in. Now, J. Warner Wallace, a former cold case homicide detective with the LAPD, I think uses a very helpful illustration to make this point clear. And it's simply this. Officers believe that their bulletproof vest can stop bullets. They often shoot bullets at their vest and see for their own eyes that the bulletproof vest can stop bullets, that it does do the job. However, when you are facing a loaded gun pointing at your chest, you now have to put your trust in the vest or believe in the vest and put your life really in what you know to be true. And that's very difficult. You may believe that the bulletproof vest can stop a bullet, but the moment a gun is pointing at you, you might run the other direction, not fully being able to trust in the vest, maybe having some doubts. But recognize that those doubts don't take away from your belief that the vest can stop bullets, but it's much more difficult to put your trust in the vest, to believe in the vest, than it is simply to believe that it's true. All right, the other common example is the person who can tightrope across the Niagara Falls, and he pushes the wheelbarrow and full of rocks and all this kind of stuff. And then he says, how many of you believe that I could put a person in this wheelbarrow and still walk across Niagara Falls on the tightrope? And everyone goes, yeah, we believe that you can do it. And then he goes, now who wants to get in the barrel? And not very many people, right, raise their hand, right? Putting your trust in that person, believing in them, and you're putting your life on the line is a very different response than believing that the person can do it. And here's the whole point, is that the evidence, as I mentioned before, often does persuade our beliefs that something exists. I can't believe that there's an elephant right behind me because there's not. I can't convince myself of that. As he pointed out, I can't just believe that Thor exists or that magic leprechauns exist. But once you believe that there's a God, or once you believe that something exists, now to actually put your trust in that God, to believe in that God, that is the difference. And so in my video, where I'm addressing the 3 reasons why people reject God, the first one is intellectual. That there are some people who intellectually have issues that they cannot believe that God exists. And that is something that is hard to you can't just say, well, just believe it. Well, I can't. It's not convincing to me. But there are others who do believe that God exists and are unwilling to admit it for various reasons. So I want to get back to the point because I'm kind of jumping ahead of myself and to some of his responses. So here's kind of his response to what I had to say there. I said, the vast majority of my students are non-religious and hold a firmly secular worldview. He goes, the vast majority? You've got Christian on the wall behind you, as well as Jesus, and pray. Do you really expect me to believe that you're teaching in a public school full of atheists? No, I'm not teaching in a public school. It is a Christian school. Even if you were teaching in a public school, I wouldn't for a moment buy your claim that the vast majority are non-religious. Well, I mean, again, as I pointed out, yeah, in Southern California, you're going to have a lot of religious people in a classroom. But I work in an international school with the main population is Chinese, which are non-religious, more secular worldview that they come from. This new information is very helpful. So hopefully in our conversations that we have, we're asking questions, trying to understand why something is true. Okay, your students are not Christian. Okay, why not? What kind of school do you teach at that most of your students would be not Christian in a Christian school? Most people find that very strange, and it is strange why mostly non-Christian students would come to a Christian school. But just calling someone out, as you'll see here in a little bit, as dishonest or not believing, maybe isn't the best response. Now, he said, I made the comment, you seem to be confusing belief in and belief that, as I pointed out to you just a moment ago. And he says, nonsense. Even Christians, most of them know the Bible isn't true. I'm not sure exactly what that has to do with exactly what I said, but here I would ask the question of, okay, how did you come to that conclusion? how'd you come to the conclusion that even most Christians know the Bible is not true? And like most books, parts of it are likely true, like there's a Jerusalem, and parts are not. Yeah, in a lot of books, that's the way, but why would you say that about the Bible? And most Christians believing that it's not true. He goes on and says on the other side, if you believe that God exists, then you believe in God. No, not necessarily. Again, I pointed out, you can believe that someone can carry you across Niagara Falls in a wheelbarrow, but that doesn't mean you're going to put your belief in them and actually put your life in their hands and get into the wheelbarrow. There's a difference between belief that and belief in. No one chooses to be tortured in hell forever and ever. And I would agree with this. I actually just covered this in the Doctrine of Hell with my high school students just last week, and I made the point, I don't think anyone chooses hell. No one looks at hell compared to heaven, truly believing that it's real and says, I want hell. I would like to go there. No one does that. But the choice that people do make is to satisfy their own desires rather than bow their knee to a creator. The choice that people do make is to reject a God that exists. And in our rejection of God and in our desire to live our life how we want to live, then God ultimately gives us over to our desires. And this is something I think, and I say often, that both Christians, both the Calvinists as well as the Arminians can agree on, is that God will send you where you want to go. If you want to be with God, then you'll pursue him. If you don't want to be with God, then he will give you separation from him. If you want to be in his presence, you will. If you don't want to be in his presence, he will separate you from his presence. That is something that we all agree on, is that you will go where you want to go. The Calvinists would say the unregenerate in their sinful, broken nature will never want God, and they want a rebellion against him. Their heart is bent towards evil. And the Arminian would say, well, they're just choosing evil and they're choosing to be apart from God. In both cases, I would say, yeah, I agree with you. No one chooses to be tortured in hell forever and ever. No one chooses to trade a magic Disneyland for the cold, hard grave. But what they're choosing, they actually think is better, or they are wanting a life without God. And I mean, the question is simple. Do you want God in this life? Many people say, no, I don't. I don't want him. And they're not maybe willing to put in the work to research. And I'm not saying that's everyone. Some people really do put in the work to research to try to figure out what's true. But there are a lot of people who say, no, I don't care. I don't want to put in the work and I don't want to know. I'm just going to do what makes me happy. And so they are making a choice that they maybe don't realize the full ramifications of that choice. And that's why I think us as Christians, we need to help people see that. He says, refusing to believe in God is not something anyone does. Of course they do. Again, belief isn't a choice. Again, belief that God is not a choice. People don't really refuse to believe that God exists, but absolutely refuse to believe in God. I've shared this many times. I've had students tell me. One student said, if I admit that God exists, I will have to stop doing the things I want to do. I think that he was convinced that God does exist, because he went from saying God doesn't exist to if I admit that he does, and recognizing if I finally make this admission, if I finally say God exists, then I'm going to be responsible for that, and then I'm going to have to stop doing the things that I want to do. Another student once told me, he said, if I become a Christian, then my life is going to change. My friends are going to look at me differently, and in short, I don't want that. People recognize, as did these two students and many others, that there is a cost to believing in God, to putting our trust in him and being like Christ. That's not a cost that everyone is willing to pay. Again, the difference between belief that and belief in. Now, really quickly, he made a few other comments on another part, some of them similar. He says, in response to my video, I said that these are the decisions. These are what influence people's decisions, their family, their friends, their culture. And he says, but these are not necessarily what causes them to believe or not believe in something. Again, I completely agree. Your family, your culture, these things don't cause belief, but they absolutely do influence you, which is why I made that comment or used that language. Belief isn't a choice, as we talked. It's not a decision. Believing that something exists, as he's right. He says, I'm comparing apples and oranges. We kind of addressed that already. He says, I'm not an atheist because I've never seen one piece of good evidence that a God exists, let alone enough to convince me that there's a diverse contradictory claims of faith-based people are actually true. And here's the last point that I want to address in our time together, and I'll get to your comment that has been sent in. He says, how about just one piece of good evidence that your God actually exists? Or maybe, since you're a Christian, one piece of good evidence that any of the magical stories in the Bible actually happened. Got nothing? Well, that's why I'm an atheist. P.S. I'm not looking for a gish gallop of vague claims, as you demonstrate in this video. You find it easy enough to rattle off vague claims, but can you pick one of those vague claims and make your case in enough detail, specific, not just vague claims, that I can judge it for myself? If you're like the overwhelming majority of Christian apologists, you won't even try, but I guess we'll see. I don't know who he's referring to as the overwhelming Christian apologists that are not willing to try, but there's a really important thing I want to address here. Now, I have a video, and I'll link to that in the description below, and I'll put another little thing up here in the corner, and it's Tactics in Defending the Faith, and it's based on the book Tactics by Greg Koukl. And if you haven't read this, I think it's extremely valuable to read. But one of the tactics that he addresses and that I talk about in that video is the first Columbo question, is what he calls it, of what do you mean by that? And here's the important point. We want to make sure that we're talking about the same thing, that we are in agreement on what is expected by making sure our definitions are right so that we can actually move forward in the conversation. And so in response to this, how about just one piece of good evidence? I asked the question, what do you mean by good evidence? My assumption was that any evidence I raise will be met with the response of, well, that's not good evidence. Can you give me a piece of good evidence? Well, what exactly is good evidence and bad evidence? And in the past, I've had conversations with this person where that same thing has happened, where I present different pieces of evidence, where I ask for evidence, and everything is met with, well, that's not good evidence. And so I wanted to ask the question, well, what is actually good evidence, so that I know what the standard is that I need to meet so that we can have a fruitful conversation moving forward? So again, he makes the claim he doesn't believe me about my students, but then addressing the question, can you please define what you would consider to be good evidence? He says, for the existence of God, I have no idea. But if you don't have any, not one piece of good evidence, why believe it? Here's why this is so important to ask this question. If he is not willing or not able to give me what he actually means by good evidence, well, then how can I present good evidence? He's asking me for good evidence, but then won't tell me what good evidence actually qualifies as. Will it be the evidence for the resurrection, that, some of the pieces, some of the evidences that make the case for the resurrection that are accepted by the vast majority of scholars and historians, both Christians and atheists? Would that be considered good evidence or not, because it doesn't complete the full picture, because you need more of a cumulative case? What exactly would it count as? And again, my response to this is simply this. Look, if you're not going to give me a standard by which I can meet on what is good evidence, then I'm not going to try. Because anything I say can easily be met with the response, well, that's not good evidence. I want good evidence. Maybe that's why other atheists haven't tried in the past. Other apologists haven't tried in the past. And so hopefully what I want to encourage both the Christian and the non-Christian in this short objection response that I have, and it's turned out to not be so short, is simply this. As we move forward in conversations from both sides, let's make sure that we are defining terms accurately, that we are in understanding of what we mean by those terms, and we're presenting evidence to actually support our terms. Because hopefully we are, and I'm not saying this person isn't, but hopefully we are open-minded individuals who will follow the evidence wherever it leads. That we will be persuaded often by good evidence, and that when persuaded, we will actually follow the evidence where it leads rather than rejecting it for other reasons. Because again, we are often emotional beings. We often are biased, and we don't always do exactly what we know to be true or even what we know to be good. We often know what is good, but it doesn't necessarily make us happy. That, I think, is true when it comes to eating stuff. That would be one example. And so hopefully as we move forward, this can be helpful in the conversations that you have. Make sure we listen. Make sure we ask good questions. If someone makes a claim that seems unreasonable, seems like an extraordinary claim, let's ask them, wow, why did you say that? How did you come to that conclusion? Rather than immediately dismissing them. No, I don't believe you. Whatever you say is false. That can't be true. Why would a classroom of atheists be at a Christian school? Well, because it's an international school where they come here for various reasons. And so hopefully this is an encouragement to you. Let me just look at this one comment that came in here really quick, and then we'll wrap up our time. All right. Yes, there's the comment. I'll put that up here. And thank you for sending this in, because that is exactly what I was claiming. I've never actually heard the term sea lioning, But anyways, yes, asking for evidence while meaning a civil and sincere pretense, all the while not knowing precisely what evidence would even be. And so that's, I think, a very helpful way in which to approach this. When someone says, prove to me that God exists. Well, first asking the question, what do you mean by God? Let's make sure that we're talking about the same God. But then it's like, hey, what would you consider? There have been some atheists that have flat out say, no evidence whatsoever. In fact, I showed this to a video of my students today, where an atheist said, no evidence whatsoever would convince me of your claims. Well, if that's true, why am I going to sit here and try? It's kind of a waste of time. The same way that hopefully you would like, well, why talk to this Christian if this Christian is closed-minded and unwilling to accept anything I have to say? At that point, we can leave the conversation, right? I want to look for people who are looking for me. Let's have a conversation with people who want to have conversations. If they're unwilling to accept any evidence or show what kind of evidence would be worth making, then why have that conversation? And again, what I was saying, and I just got sidetracked, is some atheists have said, I would believe God exists if the heavens opened up and he spoke down from me, and then they stop and go, well, I would assume that I'm having some sort of vision or something, and that it's all a delusion. So maybe that's a question to ask yourself. If Christianity were true, would you believe it? Would you actually believe in him if it actually is true that Jesus died and rose from the dead for your sins? Or is it maybe that we have a different rejection, that we simply just don't want to bow our knee to our Creator and we'd rather do whatever we want to do, even though we may be convinced that God exists? We still say, no, I just don't care. I'm going to do what I want to do. So hopefully this is an encouragement to you as you move forward as ambassadors of Jesus Christ and making a difference in your culture, in your friends, in your family, and in the workplace around you. Have a wonderful day, and make sure you do not miss the live stream this Thursday with Neil Harden talking on a biblical approach to singleness and marriage.